And with that, we'll get started with our first session for today, which is our plenary. And I'm delighted to introduce Scheel, an exemplary leader in meta research and just an all-around amazing person. Anne is an assistant professor in methodology and statistics at Utrecht University. And previously, she was a PhD student at TU Eindhoven and worked as a postdoctoral researcher at VU Amsterdam and at the Center for Science and Technology Studies in Leiden. Anne has done some of the most important meta research work in psychology's reform movement as part of the discipline's effort to recover from the replication crisis and improve the reliability and efficiency of published research. Her research combines methodological and meta-scientific elements to study how structural, social, and psychological factors influence the research process and the scientific record, and how scientific inference can be improved in practice. We're incredibly lucky to have her here with us today. I think we're in for a treat. So please join me in welcoming Anne.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That was extremely flattering. I'm super happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me over. Thank you. Well, I actually have prepared my slides with shifting everything a bit down because I know this problem, but this is even better. Yeah. So thank you so much. I'm extremely happy to be here. So to also, I think really Melbourne has like both the absolute, in my mind, the coolest community with regard to meta research. That I'm familiar with. So it's really an absolute pleasure to be back here. What I'm going to talk about today is something that actually started in Melbourne in some ways. So I was here 3.5 years ago before the pandemic when the Replicats project started, and Fiona invited me to give a presentation at the History and Philosophy of Science seminar, where I was which I used to present what was back then just like a bit an idea or like a confusion I had about how hypothesis tests are being used in psychology. And since then, this has spun into, like a whole project. We've had 2 publications about this. And today I'm actually going to present some data that nobody has seen before. So I hope that's gonna go reasonably well. So I call this talk what psychology researchers really want to know. As for those who might not be so familiar with this, it's a bit of a play on this theme that, especially in the statistics wars, I think there's often this notion that people will argue, for example, p-values are bad because they are the wrong probability. And what researchers really want to know is, for example, the posterior probability of the hypothesis given the data and not the other way around. And some people will say, but what researchers really want to know is how precisely they have estimated the effect. And this is all the while the researchers are standing in the corner and next to them, and I'm maybe feeling a bit patronized. So I also can't speak for the researchers, but I will. I asked some of them, so maybe we'll find out a bit today. So basically, a starting point of this is that, at least the way I was taught to do research in my undergrad in psychology was something like this. So the hypothetico-deductive method was kind of presented as the scientific method to me, which is, as I guess probably everyone here is familiar with, the idea is you start with a hypothesis. You design a study to test this hypothesis, you collect some data, you analyze the data, test your hypotheses, interpret the data, and then revise your hypothesis or do the next study. So this and the cycle goes on and on. And of course, this is not actually the scientific method, and there are many other ways of to do scientific inference. But I do think this is something that is very recognizable to a lot of people, and that's emphasized in a lot of research training, that this is sort of how things work. And importantly, for what I want to talk about today is that my impression is that in psychology, the replication crisis was framed very much as hypothetical-deductive inference gone wrong. So for example, people pointed out that it's a problem that the field has published studies have very low statistical power, which means that basically studies are hypothesis tests sort of are not very informative because of that. Then, of course, there's the problem of questionable research practices such as p-hacking and also hacking, hypothesizing after results are known, which invalidates some of this inference. So in particular, if you change your hypotheses after seeing the data but don't disclose that, then you haven't actually tested those hypotheses in the hypothetico-deductive way, but it's an inductive inference. And of course, p-hacking greatly increases the risk of drawing false positive inferences. And then finally, another one would be publication bias. So a lot of negative results that result from this research method don't actually get published. And so the collection of studies we have in the literature might give us a very wrong image. And then another point maybe is this, the idea that also, especially when using frequentist statistics, part of the idea is that we repeat tests, that we replicate, that we have a control our error rates over many repetitions and won't be wrong too often in the long run. Whereas in reality, we know that replication has been very rare. I think that has changed a bit in psychology over the last years, but it definitely used to be the absolute exception. This visualization isn't mine. I've stolen it from Chris Chambers. I'm not sure if he was the original author of it, but this has been presented in many contexts to sort of illustrate what went wrong in psychology and why we ended up with a very low replication rate and what needs to be fixed. And so the reforms, so basically part of my thesis is that I think a lot of the reforms that were suggested in psychology to fix this mess are targeted at fixing hypothesis testing. So for example, increasing statistical power, pre-registering in the spirit of reducing questionable research practices. So the predictions are clear ahead of time and you can't change them after seeing the data, or at least it will be transparent. Registered reports which reduce publication bias because results are published regardless of the outcome. And somewhat more, slightly more specific thing is also a push that researchers are supposed to specify and test their actual research hypotheses. So the standard statistical method in psychology, I would say, is still null hypothesis significance testing, where you basically only test if the effect is different from zero. And the research hypothesis is usually that it is different from zero, but it's not more specific than that. And there are big problems with that. It actually makes the hypothesis statistically unfalsifiable. And so there's also been this push to have researchers make their hypotheses more specific than not zero. So it should be, for example, what is your smallest effect size of interest? And there are statistical methods that you can use to test that way. And so basically, this was a very famous publication in 2012 that actually suggested that psychologists should pre-register their studies. And I think it is has a very strong title, An Agenda for Purely Confirmatory Research. So basically, the idea is the hypothesis testing needs to be protected, right? So we need to make it really tight. Actually, as an anecdote, one of the authors, Denny Bosbaum, actually says when they wrote this paper, he thought people would basically immediately recognize that the research they do is actually not purely confirmatory, and thus they don't need to do these things, that they would sort of realize, oh, this is when I have like really strong predictions, then I should do it this way. And if I'm not in this sort of mode of research, you know, I'm sort of going to do it in a different way. And the exact opposite has actually happened. So everyone has flocked to pre-registering their studies and sort of seen this as a message to say, you have to do your research in this very strict hypothesis testing way and do it with the new best methods, which includes pre-registration. So essentially, this is an idea that hypothesis testing has sort of, we've tried to crack down on all the ways that went wrong. So like all the ways in which the inferences are threatened, we're just trying to make it really watertight and separate it from anything else, essentially. This is the idea. So there's also been in this whole discourse this distinction between confirmatory testing and exploratory analyses. And that has been, I think, the main terminology. So in a way that says these are the only two things that exist. And later I'll get a bit more into why I think that might not be such a helpful idea. Okay, and so how does this actually work? There's like really strict hypothesis testing. So very famous psychologist Paul Meehl has written a lot about this and also about his frustrations that in his view, psychologists were not doing it right. So he basically presented the sort of hypothetico-deductive hypothesis testing in this Popperian falsificationist framework. So the idea is you start with you have a theory, substantive theory that says something about how the world works in general, and you want to, and to test that, you of course need other auxiliary assumptions. Some of these are other theories about sort of other parts that are relevant for how you want to test your theory. And others are instrumental, so they're just about the testing situation. So say the participants actually read the instructions, or that they don't move their heads too much in the fMRI scanner and so on. And with all these things, you basically derive a predicted observation. So this is, of course, the general idea of hypothetico-deductive inference. What makes it so powerful is that we can, the idea is from a general theory, we deductively derive a prediction about a concrete observation that has to hold. So if the theory is true, then we should observe this. And the observation, that is what we can really test. And if we can, if we falsify this, predict, like if this observation does not hold, that should be a problem for the theory. And also, if our test was really strong, so meaning that if the theory was false, then we should not observe this. That means if we do observe this, we do have some more confidence in the theory. So we do think it survived the test that was actually quite severe. So that we can grow our confidence in it. And so the thing here is that this is actually quite a complex process, because theories are general. That's part of why they are useful, is because they're not extremely specific, but they hold for a large range of things, of situations. And so to derive an actual prediction for an observation, for something that we can see in the lab that we can measure, we need a lot of other assumptions to come in, and we need to sort of make this derivation chain, as Paul Meehl calls it, from a general theory to a very specific thing that needs to be really tight. So as he wrote it, to the extent that the derivation chain from the theory and its auxiliaries to the predicted factual relation is loose, a falsified prediction can constitute a strict, strong, definitive falsifier of the substantive theory. Okay, so yeah, so this is quite a complex process, but it's potentially also very powerful. Now, I think that psychologists struggle with this strict form of hypothesis testing. And so some of the things I have noticed myself, and that also other colleagues have noticed, is, for example, the hypotheses that we see in the literature are often excessively vague, and they are not clearly linked to the analysis and also not to the conclusions in the study. So actually, it is not exactly sort of this derivation chain, like what sort of that links the general hypothesis or theory to the actual predicted observation. And that would be on a very precise statistical level. That is sort of extremely, there is like almost nothing that's like a big block. So this is something I've noticed myself analyzing papers for my own research, but it has now been echoed in a lot of other meta-scientific publications that actually had a different goal. So there are some studies that looked at, for example, how null results are presented or interpreted. That's the Edelspruner and Thuan paper, or how many, similar to some of my own studies, looking at how many positive and negative claims are in a certain literature. And there are some studies that analyzed published pre-registrations of published articles. How good are those pre-registrations now that they're becoming more common? And all of these people struggle with the fact that hypotheses are so vague and so difficult to link to the analysis, and even in pre-registration, where that should actually be taken care of, right? So all of these studies have a problem with inter-rater reliability, that different raters can't agree on even like how many hypotheses are there in the study. And I think that's actually, that's quite striking, especially when you're looking at the pre-registration. That should actually not really happen. Another point is that psychologists have been, at least, I think it's died down a bit now, but at least initially there was some opposition to pre-registration. I think you still hear these arguments sometimes. So for example, this is, I think, from 2013, This is by Sophie Scott. She collected on her blog some sort of quotes by people who seem to be upset about the idea that we should use pre-registrations and registered reports. I'm not going to go into this, but it's a nice collection of arguments that are often, well, some of them seem a bit disingenuous, but I do think there's basically a lot of people who were unhappy about this idea that we should use this that we shouldn't make hypothesis testing so strict. And the other point that I've already mentioned is that, of course, the most widely used statistical method for hypothesis testing in psychology is null hypothesis significance testing. So basically saying the null hypothesis is that the effect is exactly 0, but our research hypothesis is actually the alternative, is H1, and that is it is anything else. It's anything but 0. And the problem with that is that if that is our research hypothesis, we cannot statistically falsify it, because if we don't find evidence for it, it could always be the case that we don't have enough power. So basically, if the true effect could be somewhere here, like it could be just off of 0, it could be just not 0. And if the effect is that small, it will be near impossible to test it, because we would need an infinite sample size. And so, you could always basically excuse yourself by saying, we didn't find a significant result, but the effect could still be there, just smaller than we thought. And I think this is something that has actually happened in certain replication projects in psychology in the last years, that there was an initial effect that was pretty large. People didn't believe in it, replicated it with in very big projects. Then the result was that they found maybe the tiny effect, the equivalency of 0.04 or 0.06, and proponents of the theory would still count that as evidence in favor of their theory. And then finally is that, and I don't really have sort of formal evidence for this. This is my personal experience, but I think it is. I think there are a lot of people who have had similar experiences, that even researchers who want to specify their research hypothesis and, for example, use Bayes factors or use equivalence tests to really have a better test of the research hypothesis. And for that, for example, you need to say what size of the effect you expect. So what does your theory predict, or your theory and the conjunction of your theory and the auxiliaries? How big should the effect be, and what would not count as evidence for your theory? Even people who really want to do that, who are really motivated, really struggle with doing it. So I've worked on equivalence tests a bit myself with Daniel Atkins, my PhD advisor, and has argued for the statistical method. So that's basically the inverse of a null hypothesis test, where you set smallest effect size of interest and you test against that. And we sort of talk to a lot of people who want to use this method and want to come up with a smallest effect size of interest. We also need this for a power calculation. And people really have nothing to go on. So even people who are really trying are really struggling. So they most often have to fall back on something saying, well, this is the biggest sample size that I can collect, but they can't say what the theory predicts. This is really just so essentially, and I think this is also maybe not very surprising, the theories in psychology are just not that formal and that mature to allow very specific statistical predictions. But still, what I find interesting about all these things is that hypothesis testing is so ubiquitous in this literature, but if you look at how it's done with all these things, then it doesn't actually fit with this ideal of hypothetico-deductive inference. So basically, as I just said, in theory, this is what it sort of should be like. In practice, what we see more is that there's some verbal hypothesis, and that's often also not very clear, so there might be different versions of it throughout the paper. And then there are some statistical tests, and in between, a miracle happens. And yeah, we don't quite know what is going on. And the problem with this is that it's unclear what the inference actually is. So what do we actually learn using this procedure? Because the idea is of the theory part here, so advocated by Paul Meehl, is that if we have the strict derivation chain from the theory to the predicted observation to the test, then we can also draw an inference from our test back to the theory, right? That's the idea. It's like a really tight chain. It allows us to jump all the way back, and then that's what makes it really powerful. But if we don't have that, if this derivation chain is broken, it's unclear what we learn from our tests. And so given that this is sort of the case, my question was, what are psychologists doing then? Like, what is going on? What is this? Before maybe looking at what they are doing, we were smug enough to tell them what they should be doing. This is one paper that came out of what I mentioned in the beginning, this talk I gave here 3 years ago. And our point in this theoretical paper is basically just that. As I said in the beginning, the way hypothetico-deductive inference is taught is usually that you start with a hypothesis. You have a hypothesis. It's not clear where that comes from. I mean, okay, people say exploration, you know, to tell you what you should expect, but there's very little training on that. And so we're focusing on this, okay, have a hypothesis, test it. But clearly people can't specify their hypothesis. They don't have enough knowledge to really make an informed prediction that could actually allow meaningful inference to something bigger, right? To something that's more interesting. And so our point in this paper is basically just that there are different things that we need to do in order to have really informative hypothetico-deductive inference. So we first need to sort of explore and to observe what the world is actually like, right? To start to describe and define it, to find some common languages and some ways of measuring it. Can experiment to find out how to think about certain things, how to conceptualize. Then there's some deduction involved. So we want to establish regular patterns in the data. We want to see what is really sort of what are stable things that need explaining, what are the phenomena, and then start to construct theories. So, okay, what could be generating these stable patterns that we do identify? And then once we start actually building some general theories, that's when the deductive part of hypothetical deduction comes in. And now we need to derive like predictions from those theories. So that actually are a tight deduction. So that really say, if this theory is true, then this more specific thing should hold, which always depends on exactly how you test them. So that there's also a big sort of, a lot of research actually involved in this part before we can have like a really informative hypothesis test. And so our point in our paper was basically saying there's like a really, really diverse spectrum of research that goes into having specific predictions that lead to informative tests. And it would maybe be useful to do more of these things and not always focus on the test. If we only do the test and we don't do any of the other things, then we won't really get very far. Okay. So this was, like I said, basically first of telling people what they should be doing, but still what persists is this question of what are psychologists actually doing? Because I also don't think that people are completely stupid or uneducated. I mean, there's certainly some degree of, there's always problems with statistical literacy. Some parts of research practice are a bit mindless, or you're just repeating what you've been taught. We also heard yesterday from Mark that he really thinks there are big problems in his discipline. But I think it is also true that researchers also have genuine reasons for doing the studies they do and doing them in the way they do. There are really things that they want to find out and that they do find out. So I think it's not that the whole literature is just completely worthless and there's nothing in there. There's something there. But if it's all called hypothesis testing, but if you look closely, then it's not really, then what is it, right? And so this is my, because I had this question, decided to do a study on it, and because I didn't know what to predict, I had to drink my own Kool-Aid and say maybe what I should do first is a qualitative study, and actually just ask people what is there. So I really don't know exactly what types of things psychologists want to know. And if my suspicion is that they use hypothesis tests in a wrong way, or in an inefficient way, they overuse it, they use it prematurely. But I do think that they have genuine research questions and that they do also sort of find things out. And I want to know what's going on. So basically, the point here was saying, talk to people, say, what is it that you want to know in your research? Why did you do this study? Okay, and so now, For the rest of the talk, I will present you these results, which is a world premiere. So even my co-authors, Helene Hutjes and Daniel Lakens, haven't seen the results on this level. It is a very preliminary analysis, though, so this is the first time I'm presenting this, and I'm also a bit self-conscious knowing that there are extremely good qualitative researchers here in the room or online. And this was my very first time doing a qualitative study, so it's definitely a very steep learning curve. Okay, so basically what we did is this. We contacted researchers who had recently published a quantitative empirical study in one of 3 psychology journals. We chose Psychological Science, Journal of Experimental Psychology General, and Collabra. We wanted to have a relatively sort of broad spectrum because the scope was psychology. Of course, those journals still don't cover all of psychology, but it was a bit of a convenience decision. So we contacted people who were both the first and the corresponding author on that paper, and they had to have at least a PhD. Response rate was actually pretty good, although you might imagine that not all of these 3 journals are equally well represented in our sample. So some authors were much more keen, I think. I have no illusions that this is a representative sample. I mean, it can't be for a qualitative study of this size, but also I think it's important to know that I do think that people know Daniel Lakens' name, or a lot of people do, and maybe my name. They might have read our paper before, and so I think people who self-selected in our study might have been unusually progressive and thinking about sort of current themes in the replication crisis and in reforms of psychology. So important to be aware of that. Then what we did is we did semi-structured interviews. I did all of them. They lasted about 45 minutes, and we asked them about what they wanted to know, so what their research goals were in this published study that we contacted them for, and also in one ongoing project that they were currently doing that should be empirical. The idea here was that it's possible if we're interested in hypothesis testing, that things are actually presented as hypothesis tests sort of after the fact, and so that people would sort of present the completed research as hypothesis testing, even though it might not have been that from the start. And so we also wanted to ask about something that wasn't completed yet, where they didn't know the results yet and it wasn't written up, and so on. So to sort of get a more even view of the research process. And we also asked them about their general views on hypothesis testing and other forms of inference. Okay, so our own research questions were first, just what is the nature and range of epistemic goals that psychological researchers have, or that they tell us? So basically, what types of things do they want to know? So what types of information do they want to gain from a study? Why do they do it? The second question was the role of hypothesis testing for this. So what types of information or knowledge do they want to gain from hypothesis tests? And finally, do they perceive a norm in favor of hypothesis testing? Because this is a hunch that I have. I do think hypothesis testing is so ubiquitous that it might just also be something you have to do, or that people feel pressure to do. Okay, so onto the very preliminary results. Also another warning. So I have a lot of quotes here, and I'm not going to be able to go through all of them. So I will have to skip a lot of slides. This is an enormous amount of data with like really super interesting stuff in it. And so I will skip over a lot of stuff, but you can please feel free to ask about it afterwards, so we can look at some of the ones that I'm going to skip over now. So the first research question was, what types of epistemic goals do researchers have? So my task was basically to go through all this data and try to categorize things. So what do people tell me why they did the study, or why they want to do their ongoing study? What type of things do they want to find out? The sort of preliminary categories that I found were, first, there's definitely this category of phenomena detection, so descriptive research, but also, and I think maybe more interestingly, I noticed that a lot of psychologists talk about effects, right? They talk about things as an effect that is like an outcome of an experiment, or but this is also, this happens in a very descriptive way. So effects are not just basically outcomes of or the subject of a hypothesis test necessarily, effects are also seen as phenomena, as things that are be established, as like, is this something that that is real? And then maybe that needs explaining. I'm going to skip over the description because I think that's a bit straightforward, but it may be interesting to have some quotes of this establishing an effect. So here's one participant saying, one of the first things I wanted to know is, can we get this empirical effect, the statistical effect? And then if we got that, then I think it would be theoretically interesting. But before we start, we like start to get into theory, testing and things like that, I just feel like more of what we were doing was like, can we get the statistical effect? I think this is very clear. Another one would be, two kind of basic questions was, can we, do we show that there's this matching? So I also need to say I had to anonymize the quotes. I promised my participants to not be identifiable, and of course that means I had to delete a lot of details of the study they were working on, so that you can't go back to the journals that we pulled them from and try to find the study. I hope it's still comprehensible. So yes, yeah. Do we show that there's this matching? Does that? Do we show evidence of it? Just kind of like that simple question. Here's another one I'm going to skip over. The next category would be concept development. So concept development, the way I would conceptualize this category is that it is something about how to sort of think about not just a phenomenon, but like a thing in the world, like a concept that's useful to talk about, and how something is like organized. So this is, I felt, also has a lot to do with having models, like with fitting a model that you think like it makes sense of the data, like it makes sort of, it makes the world more easy to understand or more parsimonious, or it just like feels like this is a thing, right? This is like more of a thing. This makes more sense than what we had before. So some examples of this would be, there's one participant saying, it's sort of a qualitative hypothesis, you know, we think that the results will be clearer using this dimensional model, but we have no way to really quantify clearer except to just, you know, say, look at this big mess when we use the categorical system, and look at this nice, clean, expectable relationship when we use the dimensional system. So this is, I think that the idea is like they have an idea that this would be better conceptualized with this dimensional model, and then this will be really obvious once we have that. And another example would be, so it's more motivated by that I kind of wanted to understand what's going on. I felt like this could be a good way to model the process or to understand the phenomenon. And then that was the main motivation to then collect data and kind of get deeper into it. So it's about like understanding the phenomenon, like making, and also it became clear in the rest of the interview, it was really about sort of finding, making sense of what this actually is, how we can think about this. So not just here's a phenomenon, here's like a data pattern, but like more of a concept of it, how we can, how it relates to other things, and how we can like talk about it. Then there's methods and measure development. This is probably also not very surprising. I'm going to skip over this as well. Then a very big category I found that I'm also not sure if it's really just one category, but a lot of researchers are interested in mechanisms and processes. And so I call this category explaining causal mechanisms. You want to know why something happens. And this can happen in many different ways, but they're looking into that. So for example, I guess the idea was to get a bit more insight into at least a potential mechanism for this behavior, some way of a mechanism, something. So we're running the study to clarify mechanisms and clarify what the treatment effect is. Is this truly a synergistic effect, or is this just like that one of them is really potent, like one aspect of it is driving the whole thing? So basically, people are also comparing different potential mechanisms, these kind of things. Then there is also auxiliary testing, which I was very happy to see. So there were several participants who basically talked about, and usually it was related to methods. So they said that, for example, previous research was, for example, confounded in the way something was tested, so that something couldn't be teased apart, and they have sort of improved the method to get at if this sort of auxiliary holds, or if let's see an example of this. Now this is a bit too long. Let's look at this one. So this one is, for example, about they gave participants feedback I was interested in previous studies, we manipulated the feedback. So we had in different studies, we had relevant and irrelevant feedback from different sources, and it was all made up somehow just based on cover stories. And we were interested in how this is for real evaluations, to look at the real feedback and realistic feedback. So here I would say, the ideas in previous studies, you use fake feedback and you have an auxiliary hypothesis that's good enough, that will have the same effects as real feedback, because you want to elicit something the participant. This is not really the core theory or hypothesis being tested. It's just about how you're testing it. And here they want to sort of get at, does that actually work? Right, then we actually have theory testing as well. So I was also happy to see that. And interestingly here, I think there are cases of sort of really like, even in a falsificationist way, like saying, I want to test an actual prediction that theory makes because I think this could get theory in trouble and needs to pass that. And also other participants who say, we have a theory, but it's like pretty new, and we just want to sort of see if it holds in general. So that's not a very severe test of it. I'm going to skip over this in enough time. And then the final category is application. There were several participants who said they're interested in some real world interventions and want to see if those work. So here, some examples of that. The next step would have been the interventions themselves. So great, we know how to do this thing to people, which would be necessary for the intervention. Okay, now it's time for randomized control trials. So the student was very clear what he wanted to do in his study was basically the last step before really rolling it out to a population to see does it really hold there. And then another participant says, so that means like implied thing to it's taking these things we know in the lab, that we know in the lab have shown efficacy in improving responses. Can we take that and actually help the target population to achieve this goal? That was sort of the main central hypothesis. That was sort of the main point of the whole grant, was seeing, can these things work in these kinds of studies? So really like taking them to the field. Okay, now the second research question was the epistemic role of hypothesis tests. So how do people use hypothesis tests? What kind of things do they want to learn from hypothesis tests when they use them? And so the first insight that I found really interesting from this was that almost all participants said that they wanted to test hypotheses. So I asked them, if they hadn't brought it up themselves spontaneously, that they had hypotheses. I asked them, did you want to test any hypotheses in the study? Or do you want to test hypotheses in the ongoing study? And they virtually always said yes. So it was, I think, 18 out of 20 completed studies and 18 out of 20 ongoing studies, that range. And also interestingly, it's like it basically in every case, it seems to just serve the main epistemic goal that they have. So what I just presented, all these different things that I think is actually a really nice broad spectrum of research goals. Hypothesis testing seems to be used for all of these things. And so some themes that emerged of sort of how hypothesis tests are used, because I think that is sort of gets at what I was really interested in. What are people really doing when they do hypothesis tests? Like, what does that mean? Because as I said before, I think a lot of the time it's not this full hypothetico-deductive inference, but it's something more shallow maybe. But what does it mean then? So the first thing is we also found, I would say, genuine hypothetico-deductive inference. Very happy to see this. So here's one example. Asked, would you say these were hypotheses that you tested in the study? This participant actually says, I don't think in terms of null hypothesis testing. I think it's also interesting. I will get to this later. Yeah, I mean, the theory is unambiguous. It says this thing should be ubiquitous. And I have to go back and reread the theory to see how clearly it's stated. This theory basically says this is the way forward in these types of interventions. This is how you make all manner of interventions more effective. That's what the theory says. And in my opinion now is that it can't be done, that the theory is just wrong about these 2 points. This was like an actually very clear sort of classic falsification effort. The second theme here was that hypothesis tests used as something like signal detection. So hypothesis tests basically just serving this idea of, is there a difference or is there a relationship between variables? That would be a much more shallow way, in my opinion. That doesn't have to do with the bigger theory. So one example of that this participant basically talks in general how they see it. So they say, I do think typically when we work with especially economic games, we construct a particular situation, we're interested in what happens in the situation. Of course, sometimes we can just describe what happens, but typically, except in very rare cases, the mere description is not really interesting. What is interesting is how differences between situations produce differences in behavior. And I would say whenever I test the comparison between treatments, I'm ultimately testing a hypothesis that there is a difference, right? Even if I don't say it explicitly, sort of, otherwise I wouldn't be doing it. So I think whenever I test some sort of difference, that's a hypothesis test. So this is something I would call experimentation. It can also be exploratory experimentation. It's basically, does this thing affect this thing? And it doesn't have to be from some greater theory behind it. It's basically just finding differences, maybe even in a more descriptive way. Then the category, there was like called strong inferences. This is based on a paper by, an old classic paper by Platt. That is basically the idea that you always try to adjudicate between competing models. So you always set up predictions that are competing with each other, and it has to be A or B. Like you set up your test so that the results will either give, like sort of say it's this or it's that. So pit things against each other. I'm going to skip over that for the sake of time. And then there's a category I would call conjecture and refutation. I think this is really interesting. I'm not 100% sure that this is like, maybe needs a bit more research to see if it's there, but I'm going to show you this quote. So this participant is basically having a very descriptive project. They say, one question was what are the patterns we can find in the data? And I think that's to some extent, we do that kind of exploratory work in our projects, but we've tried to make all hypotheses sort of a priori and based on what the reasonable expectations would be in advance. So we're trying to do sort of build the hypothesis. We have some confirmatory approach to them. So we have them. That's also part of the reason why we really try to pre-register them each as the data collection went along. And this is something I've seen in some of the other interviews too, that people actually said that they think it's good practice, and especially in the context of pre-registration, is a lot of people spontaneously bring up pre-registration. There's something, this idea that even if I just want to describe things and I don't maybe have strong theories or predictions, but I want to sort of keep track of what I think will happen. So I want to have that's good practice to sort of write that down ahead of time, and maybe to aid sort of the learning process. That's why I call it conjecture and refutation. It's in this like very small way that you just say, okay, maybe I don't have maybe great reasons, but I think this will happen, and then just to see what happens, was I right or wrong? And that maybe aids the learning process, and it maybe keeps me from sort of after the fact thinking I always thought this, and sort of to keep track of what I learned and how things develop. So I thought this was interesting. And then finally, maybe not very surprisingly, a lot of participants actually seem to assume that what I meant with hypothesis testing was null hypothesis significance testing. So they kind of equate this with the statistical method. That's how they talk about it. Yeah, I'm also going to skip over this. I'm running a bit out of time. Yeah, this is maybe a very interesting part. So we also asked participants if they think that hypothesis testing is perceived as normative, if there's like a pressure or a norm or incentives in the field to do hypothesis testing as opposed to other types of things. And I would say the very clear answer was yes. You could say the way I asked about this is a bit leading, because I really did ask people, do you feel there's a norm or pressure in favor of hypothesis testing? But there were actually several people who brought this up themselves before I got to that question. And so I do think that the responses I got were not just because they were agreeing, they wanted to agree with me. So, for example, this participant said spontaneously, this paper we just discussed, I was the sole author of just trying to quickly publish something about the current snapshots of distribution, of response distributions, and relating to your previous question about hypothesis testing, and this was a different question about hypothesis testing, we actually had some issues in publishing due to most journals expecting us to do hypothesis testing. So yeah, we had to try to find a journal that would accept it just as a descriptive study. And this participant says, I don't think that we would ever get a grant if we would say that we don't have any hypothesis and that we just want to explore. But I think there's a lot of value in doing ethnography research just to see like how people work, how people interact, So this is the clear very clear statement. And this participant says, so for decades, I haven't thought about things in terms of null hypothesis testing. Again, this is like this sort of equating NHST with hypothesis testing in general. But you still have to pretend like you do, and some editors wanted to list formal hypotheses. I try to resist that, but sometimes you really can't. Okay, then my question was why? Like, sort of why do people think this is a norm? And this also came up before I like explicitly asked this. And I think that some responses to that are really interesting. I think I have to start to wrap up here, but maybe this might be a nice quote. So this, in response to my question about if there's a norm for hypothesis testing, this participant says, a little bit, I think that I tend to gravitate towards it because it's more publishable. It's easier to sell. So you can sell it to a journal, you can sell it to an audience. People like answering questions. People like it when you can answer a question or you set up like this. Is it A or B? Aha, interesting. And this is something that was like, this was, I think, a theme I saw in more questions. So yeah, I'm going to skip over the rest here to come to my conclusion. So what I think I've learned from doing this study, this is a really, really interesting experience. So I do think psychological researchers have really broad interests, and they do study a very wide range of epistemic goals, and actually a wider range than I had expected. So I think this covers almost all parts of the empirical cycle. And if saying back to this paper we wrote about sort of all the research we should do to sort of lead to informative hypothesis tests, I do think at least on some level, researchers do that. They do really test it or are interested in different parts of information that you would need to get at maybe stronger theory, to test your auxiliaries, you know, to sort of make better predictions. But what's also the case is that some form of hypothesis testing seems to be used for almost all of these goals. And this is weird. So I think that's because I think it's quite clear that for some like hypothesis testing is a tool, right? It does some things really well, it can be powerful for some things, but maybe not so much for others. And if you use it for everything, that doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem very efficient. So I think I think what also becomes clear from these interviews, hypothesis testing is a really fuzzy concept. It's also used in very different ways. People understand it in different ways and use it in different ways. So maybe it's actually not a useful term. You know, so maybe people use it for everything because they actually do different things. We all subsume it under hypothesis testing, and then this is like sort of conceptual stretching. Or it could be an inefficiency in standard research practice. So maybe there is a potential to say, hey, you know, if you want to sort of achieve this goal, then maybe this would be the most effective and efficient method for you to get there. And maybe you've only been trained in hypothesis testing, but maybe here's some other things that would be really useful for you to know. And then, yeah, I would say hypothesis testing is clearly perceived as normative. And an interesting thing is that I think the reason for this, and actually people themselves, a lot of participants themselves seem to prefer hypothesis tests. Not all of them, but some do, and some explains with ease of communication, also efficiency in data collection, that you can sort of use a smaller set of data for. Okay, just I'm going to close with this, I think, very spot on response by a participant said, I mean, I think hypothesis testing is definitely the kind of the norm, but I'm not sure that most people would have particularly complex thoughts about what that means, including myself. I think this captures it pretty well. Thank you very much. Sorry for going over.
No. Thanks so much, Anne. So we have time for a few questions. If anyone has questions, yeah.
Thanks. You know, I love your work. I have to ask, in terms of regarding hypothesis testing normally, did anyone bring up the idea that that's important to the Popperian model of science, and that hypothesis testing is better because it's real science?
I think not, actually. I don't think anyone referred to Popper at all, I think. And so basically all of the responses to that were more in terms of this is how we're trained, this is what journals expect, this is what it's easier because everybody does it, it's easier to do it. It's like, several people said that they have experience with more open-ended research and that they actually found it difficult to analyze data that way. I don't think, I'm going to go back to the data and check for sure, but I don't think anyone spontaneously said that, actually. Yeah.
Sort of leading on from that, I would just from a student perspective, we are specifically told to do that, and if we try to do it a different way, I know personally when in proposals and things, if I've done anything alternative to that, we're told to change it. So potentially there's this thought that later on you'll have more freedom, but we never actually thought outside of that. When you get to that point, that's kind of like, well, where do we go?
Yeah, yeah. So I just forgot that I should maybe rephrase the questions for the people online. So this point was basically saying that that's part of the training, right? That you're told to actually do hypothesis testing, I guess, and if you deviate from it, you're asked to even revise your proposals and to change it. And it's actually, I've experienced this myself in teaching I was involved in, but not leading in, that students sort of had to, I think this is very common, students have to come up with a hypothesis, even for like very, very short-term empirical projects, just as an exercise to learn how to do these things, but it's always part of the assignment. And sometimes in I think ridiculous situations where it is impossible to come up with a useful hypothesis, especially because you don't tell them how. Like that's the weird thing about it, right? So I definitely agree, and this is also part of. I definitely think that there is some poverty of inference methods, and we need to teach more of these things, and so they also need to be acceptable, right? And people need to be allowed to do that. They need to have outlets for that. And I don't think that's trivial, because I also really sympathize with, and I think participants who basically said doing very open-ended research is more difficult to assess, to appraise. I think it's also true, and that's part of my point. I think we could develop, I mean, there are methods for different types of things, not that they don't exist, but we need to learn them, and we also need to agree on certain ways of assessing them. I think it's also part of, I think reviewers even don't really know what to do sometimes, and then something just doesn't get off the ground because nobody knows how to tell better science from worse science in this area or this way of thinking. Yeah.
I got some with my limited experience in health. There is an emerging trend in health research where the qualitative research, the induction box in the flowchart, is sort of coupled with the quantitative research in the model that is used to qualitative study. So the qualitative, the inference part actually kind of always is accepted as a research output when it's coupled together with the quantitative research. So is there a parallel model in psychology and research that can work to
Yeah. I can try. Yeah. So the question was the point that in health research, in inductive, like there's this increasing trend of using mixed methods for qualitative. So these are combined with quantitative aspects for the purpose of induction. Right? That's fair. And if there's a similar thing in psychology, or if that might help. I think it definitely exists. Like there are people who do mixed methods. I think it's a very it's a very small minority. This is not and I haven't really seen any signs to see this is like that it's taking off or that it's growing, but I'm also maybe not the best person to assess this. I think it's a really interesting point, definitely. So I think this might be one of these ways of saying, we can combine things in a way or make them easier for people to interpret and assess, and sort of see what is this, what does this tell you, even for people who don't have so much training in that area and with that method, which I think is part of the problem, right? Like if a lot of people start using a method that nobody else knows how to use, then so basically mixing it is might actually be a really smart idea.
I'm wondering if you look into the history of behavioral economics, which is the intersection of economics and psychology. So it's really interesting when you ask the question, where do hypotheses come from? I think about the beginning of that field, and it was just a list of effects.
and the economists don't know what to do with that. You know, they don't know how to fit them into their mathematical models. And then Kahneman started working with Tversky, who I thought Tversky was an economist for a long time. So I found out he was a mathematical psychologist. But he knew how to take the psychological concepts and fit them into the mathematical models that economists are using. And eventually Dan Kahneman won a Nobel Prize in economics, you know, for the work, because he advanced the field by building those psychological concepts into the models that we start with. So there's a book by Michael Lewis called The Undoing Project, which is about how these two psychologists work together and how they develop their theories. So it's a really interesting story about kind of where the hypothesis come from.
Yeah, thanks for this point. And no, I have, so the point is, if I have looked, or if I'm familiar with the history of behavioral economics, where apparently in the beginning the field started with a lot of effects of phenomena, and the economists didn't really know what to do with that, and Kahneman and Tversky were responsible for integrating psychological concepts into in a way that economic theories could make sense of, and being obviously very successful field. I think that's a really good point. Yeah, I'm like superficially familiar with this history, but not in detail. But I think it is really interesting. I think there are some other examples I know where, for example, psychology is combined with models from evolutionary anthropology, things like that, that I think can be extremely successful when you sort of integrate and sort of try to include something in an area where you have very formal models, and you sort of take the psychology and make it fit. That can really, gain some traction. And basically, you make use of tools that exist elsewhere that have something to say. So.
Thanks for the talk, Anna. It's really fascinating. I think it's really interesting to get into my research that actually. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the main impediments to the adoption of alternative players like this. No hypothesis. Dominant paradigm, and there's no shortage. What are the trickiest things about better products?
Yeah. So the question is what I think are the biggest impediments for adopting different methods, or for example, getting people to not only use null hypothesis significance testing. It's a very good question. I only have my own opinions, right? I think this needs more research. What I think is, so clearly, like I said, training. So there are a lot of people who just don't. So basically, I think the problem is less that an individual can educate themselves to use other things and try other things. The problem that they will run into, I think, is that their peers don't know what to do with it. So I actually think that the peer review process might be a really important point. You need to have enough peers who know how to evaluate something. And I think that is part of why research that doesn't use hypothesis testing might get rejected because people basically say, the only way I can assess the quality of something is to tell if it's significant or not. I mean, that's like a bit of an overstatement, but I think there's something to that. And so you need somehow to get enough traction to educate enough people or develop standards that there's also enough people who can evaluate it and who can do something about it. And of course, that's a complex problem. I don't know exactly how to do that. But I think this is one of the points that I think might actually be really relevant.
So thank you. I found this really fascinating, partly because I often struggle in mentoring PhD students that they will start with actually proposing things that are purely descriptive. And it's in a way, so I'm working with them to get them to actually create hypotheses. And it's an exercise of putting your cards on the table and looking at what you know from the previous literature. So someone who has actually done a fantastic job of summarizing why they were interested in the topic and what the previous literature said. And then when it goes to describing the research they're intending to carry out, it's just kind of like a boring descriptive frequencies type research. So I want, I understand, like, so I guess that's just maybe supporting your point that training is needed in when a hypothesis might be appropriate or less appropriate, and how to do that in a way that is not vague. But I think there is a real place for it in terms of, I guess I would say, getting people to put their cards on the table.
Yeah. So the point was that this is something that often comes up in training too, that PhD students would propose studies that are just descriptive, and that there is something about hypotheses as in putting your cards on the table that might make things a bit more interesting, and also help process literature and sort of move forward, right? I do think that I think there's something to that, definitely, that sort of creating hypotheses, thinking about this is also might push you to actually process information in a different way, make better sense of something, and then also, for a whole field to learn more, right? It's also about this being, but having something that is provocative, right? That can be. So sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but one thing that I actually find really interesting is that when researchers make a claim that something is true, and this could be that a hypothesis holds, but it can also be inductive. I think one really interesting property of that is that it allows other researchers to criticize it, right? To say, I think you're wrong. And in purely descriptive research, that's very difficult. So it's like, okay, like these are the data, right? So I don't know. So I do think there is also something very positive about hypothesis testing, maybe, or other forms of binary claims, because I think they get a sort of community critical discussion going and can facilitate that. So as always, I do think we need good descriptive research. So the question is how and what forms can it work well, right? And how does it not fall sort of under the bandwagon or under the off the wayside? Because I do think the monoculture is not good, but I don't disagree that it can be. They're really good. It has very good properties too.
Unfortunately, we have to wrap up there. We're heading into the next session for anyone who's here for the mini note on big team science that's coming right up, so please stay tuned. But for now, let's thank Scheel for her.